The Florida marsh is quiet, but it's a specific kind of quiet. Not peaceful, really. More like a heavy, wet blanket that muffles everything. On a sticky morning in August 2017, the only thing cutting through that quiet was the sound of a phone call. A mother was on the line with 911, her voice shaking, trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense at all. She was trying to explain how her daughter, a girl who showed up, who called back, who was full of life, had just evaporated. Her name was Savannah Gold. She was 21 years old, and by the time her family knew for sure she was missing, the answer to where she'd gone was already sitting just a few miles down the road. It was hidden under the dark, still water of a retention pond, wrapped up in something so ugly and violent that it's hard to hold in your head for too long. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about the specific kind of damage that happens when you trust someone you work with, someone you once loved, and that trust turns into something lethal. It's about a family being ripped apart and left with one question hanging in that thick Florida heat. How does a night that starts with two people clocking out of a shift end with one of them on fire? Wednesday, August 2nd, 2017, Jacksonville, Florida. The dinner rush at the Bonefish Grill out in the Mandarin area was just about done. The noise was dying down, fewer plates clanking, the grill cooling off. Working the floor that night was Savannah Gold. People who knew her described her as a burst of energy, the kind of person with a big laugh and a bigger heart. She was the type of server who'd leave those little light-up dinosaur toys as a tip for her tables just because she thought it was funny. To her mom and her family, she was the glue, the sweet baby. She had this thing about the number 21. It was her jersey number from sports. She had it tattooed on her skin in Roman numerals. Her mother, Sharon Gold, would say later that the number just seemed to follow her around. At the time, it felt like a lucky charm. Nobody knew it was about to become a marker of something else entirely. Savannah was on the closing shift, but she wasn't working it alone. Right there beside her, not just as another employee, but as the guy in charge, was Lee Rodarte Jr. Lee was 28, a culinary manager. He was also Savannah's ex-boyfriend. Their relationship was the kind of messy, on and off, complicated thing that everyone else in the restaurant knew about, but mostly tried to ignore. You know the type, the kind of drama that cooks up hot and fast in the back of a busy kitchen. Detectives would later piece together what happened next from a camera mounted on a nearby building. Just after 9:45 p.m., Savannah walked out, ended her shift, and walked to her car, a black Honda Civic. She parked it and got out, but she didn't leave the lot. The surveillance video, grainy and silent, shows her walking across the dark pavement and climbing into the passenger seat of a white Honda Civic. That car was Lee's. That footage is the last time anyone saw Savannah Gold alive. Inside that car, things went sideways. An argument started. According to Lee's later account, they were fighting about their relationship, about maybe getting back together. In that hot, cramped car, whatever line existed between being angry and doing something you can't take back got crossed and left in the rearview mirror. When the sun came up on Thursday, August 3rd, Savannah wasn't answering her phone. Her family knew immediately that something was wrong. Not just, oh, she's busy wrong, catastrophically wrong. Savannah was the type of person who checked in. She didn't ghost her own mother. And yet, her black Honda was sitting right there in the Bonefish Grill parking lot, locked up tight. Inside, on the passenger seat, was her purse, her wallet, and her phone. It looked like she'd just stepped out for a second and never came back. Then the texts started coming. Messages sent from Savannah's phone to her family. To her mom, the words just felt off. The tone was wrong. The grammar was a little weird. It didn't sound like her daughter typing. Savannah wouldn't say she was running off to start a new life without grabbing her stuff or making an actual phone call. These messages weren't a goodbye. They were a smokescreen, a poorly written script to buy time. And investigators would figure out pretty fast that the person typing those words out wasn't Savannah. It was Lee Rodarte, probably sitting not far from where he'd left her. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office started a missing persons case right away. They went to the last place she was seen, the restaurant. They pulled the security footage. They saw a woman park and get into a guy's car. They saw movement that looked like a struggle. They saw the car pull away, and they figured out who the driver was. On Saturday, August 5th, 3 days after Savannah went missing, they brought Lee Rodarte in for a talk. At first, he played along. He admitted he was with her. He said they fought, sure, but he claimed she was fine when he dropped her off at a gas station. He was just the ex-boyfriend, the concerned coworker who didn't know anything. But the detectives had the video. They had the truth on a hard drive. In that small interview room, they played the tape, and they played it again. They showed him the freeze frame of his own body, leaning hard toward the passenger seat. They asked him, if she got out at a gas station, why is the last image we have of her in your car while you're the one driving away? The story he'd built just crumbled. Lee Rodarte confessed. He told them he snapped. They were fighting in the car, and he put his hands around her throat. He strangled her until she stopped moving. But the confession didn't end with the killing. It went into the panicked, awful things he did next. He drove off with her body in the seat next to him. He headed to a secluded, wooded spot on the west side of Jacksonville, near a retention pond off Club Duclay Drive. He pulled her out of the car. In an attempt to make the problem go away, he poured gasoline on her body. He lit a match. He watched her burn. Then he dragged what was left into the murky water, hoping the swamp would just swallow the whole mess and keep quiet. Hours after he talked, Lee led the police right to that spot. On Sunday, August 6th, divers went into the pond and brought up the remains of a young woman. They were too badly burned to identify by sight. The details that came out in the months afterward are hard to hear. The autopsy was a brutal document. Because of the damage from the fire, the medical examiner couldn't say with total certainty if she died from being strangled or from something else, like blunt force. But they were clear about the violence involved. Over 75% of her body had second and third degree burns. The fire had done exactly what Lee wanted it to do. It erased fingerprints, it hid wounds. But it didn't hide what happened. It was a final act of cruelty, a way of trying to deny her family even the chance to look at her face one last time. But why? That's the part that sticks with you. Was it just a sudden loss of temper, a crime of passion, like he said, or was there more to it? There was a detail from the investigation that points toward something colder. Just hours before she was killed, Lee had gotten access to Savannah's phone. He'd changed the passwords to her iCloud and her social media accounts. He locked her out of her own digital life before he ever laid a hand on her. That's not a guy who just loses it in the heat of the moment. That's a guy taking control, cutting off her connections, making sure she was isolated. The motive, at its core, seems to have been exactly that: control. Savannah was young, she was looking ahead, and by all accounts, she was trying to get out of that toxic back-and-forth cycle with him for good. For someone like Lee Rodarte, who had power over her at work and a messy history with her outside of it, her walking away was probably the one thing he couldn't handle. The justice system took its time. Lee was charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. He pleaded not guilty at first. For almost 4 years, the case just sat there in legal limbo. For Savannah's family, especially her mom Sharon, who was fighting her own battle with stage 4 cancer at the time, the waiting was a whole other kind of prison sentence. Then in February of 2021, right before the trial was supposed to start, Lee changed his plea. He stood in front of Judge Jeb Branham and said he was guilty. On March 11, 2021, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. It was a plea deal that kept the Gold family from having to sit through a public trial and relive every second of it. But it also meant Lee avoided a life sentence. 40 years. It's a long time, but it has an end date. Savannah doesn't get one of those. In her statement to the court, Sharon Gold talked about the number 21 again, the number her daughter loved, the number she wore. And now, she pointed out with this heavy, awful irony, it was part of the year her daughter's killer would go to prison. The number followed her right to the end. Lee Rodarte will be in his late 60s when he gets his first chance at parole. The Gold family will carry the weight of August 2nd for the rest of their lives. But even with a confession and a conviction, some things just stay stuck. Could anyone have seen this coming? Were there warning signs at work that people brushed off or didn't want to get involved in? How does something that starts as dating someone you see at the restaurant every day end up in a swamp with a fire and a 911 call? And the question that's probably the hardest to sit with. In those last few seconds, in that dark parking lot, when Lee lunged toward her, did Savannah know what was happening? Did she realize that the argument wasn't just another fight, but the end of the line? The swamp eventually gave up its secret, but the silence left behind, the absence of a laugh, a future, a life that was just getting started, that part stays. If this story touched you or gave you something to think about, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and drop one word in the comments that best describes how you feel right now. And if you want more stories like this delivered straight to you, join our growing community by subscribing and turning on the bell notification. Every single subscriber helps us keep creating meaningful stories that actually matter. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.